So first of all, welcome. We know you have lots of choices in workshops and we're glad you chose ours. So thanks for coming. This is social networks, a enormous flyover of all manner of things related to social networks. I'm Alan Daly. I'm at the University of California, San Diego. I'm joined by my dear friend and colleague, Kara Finnigan. Kara?
Kara Finnigan. I am at the University of Rochester. And as I mentioned in the last group, Alan and I have been working on this for a very long time with a lot of data. And so we're going to give you our best of version in this short period of time to help you think about how social networks might be useful to your work or the broader field.
Great. Thanks, Kara. Okay, so before we get started, and while we can see all of your beautiful faces and wonderful brains, we want to do a little poll. I want to get a flavor for who's in the room before we jump in. So our dear friend and colleague, Mary Ellen, look at that, Mary Ellen. How fabulous is this? If you would just take a moment and fill out this very sophisticated poll that we've crafted, and then we'll see who's in the room. Oh, I guess I have to do it.
Ten out of 10. All right, y'all. What are our results?
Look at us. Okay, excellent. Because we always try to, we do this in the hopes that we're going to actually gauge what we're about to do in the next 75 minutes. And it looks like we don't have any a huge number of experts in social networks. So that's a good thing because I think it would be exceedingly frustrating if it was. So let's go ahead and jump in. Let me share my screen, which I did so inelegantly at the plenary. So let's see if I can do it better here today. Can you all see this? Fabulous. Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Got a great first name, by the way. So I'm Alan Daly. Kara, you heard about us. This is actually a social network map from some work we've done. And if you're at the plenary, you know that we started out with an acknowledgement of land. And we both feel really strongly that we want to do this again, given where we are in this moment and this time. So we acknowledge the First Nations people throughout the world and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. We recognize where we stand, and where I stand here in San Diego is on Kumeyaay land. Kara, where do you stand?
I am on Onondaga and Haudenosaunee.
Thank you. And was built upon this unceded territory that we both stand on. First Nations people, and we pay our respects to all individuals, cultures, elders, and leaders, past, present, and emerging. And we're honored to share this collective space with them and with all of you. And so this is our starting point. So Karen and I want to start here in a little bit what we talked about in the plenary, and you're going to see a Van Gogh theme that goes throughout this presentation. We always like to theme out our presentations, and the reason we're starting with Van Gogh is because this was his last painting, and it was about roots and the interconnection of roots, and I shared something about the Wood Wide Web. And so this idea about our interconnections and our sharing resources is something that's really at the heart and soul of a social network approach. So Kara and I have been doing work, as Kara said, for a very long time. I wasn't quite happy about the way she emphasized very, made me feel like, sort of seemed like it was just flying by. But why don't I have Kara talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing over the last 2 years. Kara?
Great. So Alan showed this earlier in the plenary, but I'll just give a little more detail to it so you have a sense of the work we've been doing. We started this work with WT Grant a while ago, and it was a 5-year longitudinal study of how evidence and other types of things flow throughout districts. And our starting point was around understanding low performing schools and low performing systems under accountability accountability, oh my gosh, I can't talk today, policy sanctions. And we wanted to understand, like, once they were placed under the sanctions, how things happen. Like, what did they do? How did they share ideas? What kinds of things informed their work? So we studied 1 mid-size and 2 large urban districts. And we were trying to figure out, these ideas of flows and of research evidence, like I mentioned, through surveys and interviews with people at the school and district level. So as you see, there's over 1,000 educators. And this part was funded by WT Grant. We also have some work that was funded by Spencer Foundation also, but we're going to talk about the WT Grant part today. Next slide. So the 2 things, we were talking earlier about mixed methods, how WT Grant likes mixed methods. We also like mixed methods. And it can be really helpful in the social network work, as we'll talk about a little bit later. But here we just summarized that we had both case studies and surveys. The case studies were both at the school level and the central office level again. We were looking at both high and low performing schools and the entire system. And we did that through interviews, observations, and document review. So some of the things we were talking about earlier in the plenary. And then the surveys, which is our focus today, the questions had to do with both their social networks, organizational learning, and also research evidence. Again, we think about the networks at 2 levels, the school level, and then the leadership. What we mean by that is the principals of all the schools and the central office leaders. We considered that a leadership network. And we did surveys over time. We did interviews over time too, but we did surveys over time. And so we had both point in time analyses for each of those years, but also a matched sample to do some longitudinal analysis. And all of our response rates were 80% or above. And, a lot of that has to do, you'll know that that's fairly high for district work. And a lot of that had to do with our focus on providing them information at the beginning about the kinds of work that we were doing. And we shared back the data at the end so that they could, not that it was anything they, could tell who was who, but just more without any information at the aggregate level to be able to see the networks and then use them for their own work. So that also, I think, helped with our response rates.
And just a note on this, that in the social network world, in the kind of work we want to do, getting high response rates is really important. So as you're planning out your design, really building in that time initially to get people excited and to think about the work, and then just be prepared to be a pesterer in chief, your perseverance will really pay off.
Can I ask a quick question about that? About the
Sure, of course.
Enticing people to participate. So when you say we shared with them information at the beginning and at the end, I'm thinking of like the beginning of the project when you started to gather this data. Is it real time, like where they enter submit on a survey and then they kind of see the results, or?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great question. No, it's not like that. There are some ways we could do that now, but it's not like that. Now we go and we talk, I remember Karen and I went and met with all the leaders and talked to them about, like, what is this social networky thing and why is it something to pay attention to? And then sort of socialize them a little bit around the instrument, what the instruments look like, because we're asking people to actually name other people or to identify other people. And so there's a little bit of a hurdle that you have to get through. So sometimes it's been the case, we've done that presentation and then we've had people fill out the surveys online at that moment, but the data isn't coming up in real time at all. It's a good question, Christy.
Thank you.
Kara?
Great. So we have, over this time period, a lot of different findings, but we wanted to highlight just a few of these high-level ones for you and to help you see how this connects to the network analysis. So the first is that we found that the social network analysis was really critical to understanding these things because it helped us to see that these new ideas and practices were least likely to reach to the lowest performing schools. So one way that we do that, and you'll see some of the maps in a moment, is that we can, it's like an attribute of the school is whether it's low performing or not. And so we could trace where things were going through the ties that people have. Another thing that we did was we found that there were weak internal connections and high levels of distrust. So when we're looking at the network maps, you'll see that, each map helps us to think about a different kind of resource that goes through. And so in many, we've been talking about research evidence as one one thing that goes through these connections, but trust is also something that goes through these connections. And so we're able to look at these things in combination and see how over time the accountability policy pressures and the high levels of distrust were even weakening those connections, and so disrupting them, so there were fewer ties over time. And then central office plays an important role in supporting or constraining the work of schools. You'll see on our maps later where we can visualize and look at some measures of fragmentation and things like that that help us to understand these different parts of the system, whether it's the school leaders or the central office. And then we look at the ways the ties are flowing. And so it's sometimes if central office is not going to the schools to understand anything, they're just sort of telling things, versus vice versa. You can see the flow of information and how that supports or constrains work. Another area around this that I mentioned, trust, has come up a lot in a lot of the different research evidence studies that William T. Grant has funded. And why that's important is because it helps in the exchange of more complex kind of ideas and changes that have to happen. And so when we're looking for, we'll talk a little bit more about reciprocal ties, for example, as a way to see the quality of relationships, and that more reciprocal ties can help in terms of this kind of complex area of change, like schools that are under sanctions and trying to develop new ways of teaching, new structural practices and things like that. And last, we've been working over time on this area, but we just also have been working on a book chapter right now on the role of brokers. And you'll see in some of the maps how there's sometimes a person or a few people who control a lot of what flows through the network, because they're actually connecting people who otherwise aren't connected. And so that can be a really critical role. They can serve as like a gatekeeper, keeping information from people, or they can serve as a flow of information between people. So we'll get more into this with the maps themselves, but we wanted to help you hear by hearing some of our findings. And then as we look at the maps, it'll be a little more clear.
Great. Thanks, Karen. So, so we're going to take you back in time a little bit to 1932. So this is the picture of the first published sociogram from 1932. It was done by Jacob Moreno, who was at Harvard at the time. And this is from the Hudson Camp for Girls in upstate New York. And in 1932, there's a whole bunch of runaways at the camp, which turns out to be not a great thing for camp people. And so Jacob Moreno went up and sort of drew up this sociogram. So what you're looking at here is you're looking at this C12, which represents like a cabin that some runaway girls were in. C10 is another cabin. And then the circles here represent the runaway girls, initials of their names. And this is one of the first studies to establish about social influence around behavior. And now if we sort of fast forward in time, we've been able to look at the role of social networks and social influence on things like obesity, on happiness, on voter behavior, on alcohol use, smoking, and yes, the movement of research evidence. And so this idea that there is some relationship between the sets of relationships that we have and some kinds of behaviors is a really important one and central to our work. And as we shared in the plenary, we sort of think about two kinds of systems that are at operation. The first one is this formal system. And this is one that we're typically used to when we go in and do any work in schools or in other kinds of organizations, that there's a discrete set of boxes and people doing their own kinds of activities. And that kind of model has dominated us for a while. But in our work, we think about things a little bit differently. And so this is a social network. And each one of the nodes here has been colored by one of the positions that they are in the formal network. And so we could go about our business as we usually do, and we only talk to people in the formal positions. But in this particular example, we can see that the all-knowing, all-seeing red eye is actually quite marginalized in a social system. So we're trying to push on this idea that you have to look at different kinds of systems and sets of interactions. Now, before I just want to be respectful of all things boozy, because it's Friday before a weekend and we're in the middle of this pandemic and a whole bunch of other things. So want to also share you can draw networks around beer. So we did wine before beer. We're trying to be an equal opportunity drink provider here. And it just sort of points out the idea one, that I'm thinking too much about drinking these days, but secondly, that we can imagine different kinds of relationships between different kinds of things. And that's at the heart of the social network space. It's this idea about relationships. And this is a picture of a social network that I shared before, but we're going to go into a little more depth around it. So this is from the play Hamlet. And what I've done here is I've taken the play Hamlet and put all the nodes, those would be the actors like Claudius and the Queen and Hamlet. And then the line between them, which is referred to as an edge, in this case is around friendship or an ally relationship. So the way that you read this is that Polonius identifies Ronaldo, with whom they have a friendship tie, but Ronaldo does not reciprocate that relationship. So it's a one-way relationship. So the dots here represent individuals or people. The line, which is called an edge, represents the flow of resources. And when you collect that data across a system, like a bounded system, could be a school or a organization of some sort, and you ask everybody to tell them their interactions around others, you can create these social structures. And what's kind of cool about these is that each individual actor can occupy a particular place in social space. So for example, Hamlet is a very central actor. A lot of individuals identify Hamlet with whom they have an ally or a friendship relationship. The same is true of Claudius. And we can think about these central actors as having disproportionate influence over what's moving in a network. So for example, if this was a school and we were looking at research evidence and we were looking at the way that Hamlet was sharing research evidence, we would say that the research evidence that Hamlet is sharing has a disproportionate influence over what's being moved in that social system than somebody like, for example, Gentleman B. So by understanding where people sit in a social structural position, we can start understanding something about their potential role of influence in a system. We can also think about brokers as another example. And brokers are ones that connect otherwise disconnected others. And Kara talked a little bit about our work in brokerage. Many of us who are on this call right now are also playing brokering roles. We're moving research evidence between and among different kinds of groups or individuals. And brokers are really important because they connect folks that would otherwise be disconnected. Somebody used this example over here, my two favorite ones, Gravedigger and Second Gravedigger. And so Second Gravedigger is completely reliant on Gravedigger from all the resources that flow through this network because he has no other connection to anyone else, which means Gravedigger could potentially filter, hoard, change, or move the information right along to Second Gravedigger. So it's important because when information, just like the game of telephone, moves from one individual to another through another, it can change slightly. So what's important to remember here is that when we create these social networks, it creates a social structure. Once we understand the social structure, we can start to understand something about the flow of resources. Those resources may be evidence or friendship or collaboration or playing music with, for that matter. So the social network work is based upon 4 key assumptions. And back in the plenary, which seems like days ago, Vivian talked a little bit about the affordances and constraints of networks, or affordances and constraints of different kinds of methods. And so we want to put forward the 4 assumptions that undergird social networks. The first one, assumption 1, is that individuals are assumed to be interdependent. So when we work in our systems, we assume that individuals are somehow bumping up against one another. The second assumption is that relationships are regarded as conduits for the exchange or flow of resources, right? So before we showed you an example of friendship. So those relationships, friendship could flow between them, but of course could be research evidence or a variety of other kinds of things. The third key assumption, and I mentioned this before, is that the structure of the network has an influence on the resources that are flowing from one actor to another actor. So we make some assumption that the larger notion of the structure has influence on the overall structure of the network, but also on individuals. And then finally, the fourth assumption is that these patterns of relationships present dynamic opportunities. So if you're really central, you have the opportunity to access a bunch of resources, but you also have to manage a lot of relationships, right? So it's sort of like the difference between being the queen and the queen maker. If you're the queen, yes, you have a lot of power and influence, but you have to manage a lot of queenly things. If you're the queen maker, you only have to manage a couple relationships, right? but you might not have as much influence over the larger system. So again, I want to review these 4 assumptions because they're key. 1, individuals are interdependent in a social network approach. Secondly, relationships are regarded as the conduits for the movement of resources. Thirdly, the structure of the network has influence. And finally, the patterns of these relationships provide both affordances and constraints to the resources you're able to access. And so we're going to give you an exercise now in which you sort of try this out a little bit. So Kara, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. So we have been talking a lot about the structures of networks like an organization, but now we want to think about your own network. You're in your own ecosystem or your own ego network. So if you could think about or jot down on a piece of paper, you in the middle, and then 3 concentric circles around it. And what we want you to do is just jot down a few names of people who are important to you in accomplishing your work. They don't have to be in your organization. They could be anywhere, but they help you with your work. And put them in the circle that is as close as they are to you. And we don't mean that by proximity, but we mean that in terms of your relationship with that person. And so if you could just take a moment, jot down, again, you, the 3 circles, and a few names as far as who helps you accomplish your work. And when you're done, you can just look back up, give me a thumbs up for whichever one works for you, and then we'll finish up this activity. Thanks, Christy. Great, thanks. Looks like people are wrapping up. So one thing to think about now is, and this, we could do an activity with this particular thing for a much longer time, but just think about if there are any people in that you've jotted down that actually, if you connected them, sometimes it's hard to know who's connected to who outside of your own networks, but maybe you know some that if you connected them, you might be able to increase some kind of knowledge or change some dynamic around information flow in whether it's in your organization or outside. So that's one thing to think about, is how you might leverage those kinds of connections you have. Another thing to think about is, could someone who you have on the outside of your circles be moved in closer so that you have some kind of stronger relationship, some different patterns of information that you might flow depending upon how close they are. So the why we do this is to help you see not just the description of where the network is at one particular moment in time, but there's also ways that, depending on the kinds of questions you're asking or things that you're doing, you could leverage those networks or try to, change over time the kinds of networks that you have. And so this is individually, you might think of this as far as your own network and the connectedness of the people in your network as a separate way of thinking it compared to the overall network structure that we were just describing. Alan, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to say that, so for those of you that are qualitative researchers, this is a fabulous interview tool to use. We've done this exact exercise with folks in our work and have asked them to really think about those sets of relationships. So it just sort of helps people to start thinking in this relational kind of way. Should we move on?
Sure. So we also wanted to give you a sense of some different measures that we use. There's a lot of different ones you can use, but these are some common ones and the different levels that we think about these measures. So I'm going to talk about, again, just this overall network structure and some of the key measures, density and reciprocity. Go on. So density is important in thinking about, so we've talked about how you might have an organization. So a lot of times Alan and I are doing bounded networks where we have everybody in the organization answering these questions. And so you can see how dense those connections are, which is just a simple calculation of how many ties exist out of all the ties that could possibly exist. And so empirically, once we've asked the questions of everyone, we can find out how dense that is. And in some ways that helps us to understand sort of the cohesion of the network itself, but also there's, the body of literature in this area helps us to know that it can help, dense networks can help move things more quickly through the system. And sparse networks, it's hard to have things move. So if you think about it as, what's going to flow out, it's usually the more dense networks that can have things go throughout the system. And so if you want something that's sort of easier to just move through, you can think about it as a cohesive network, like in a school district. If you want something to go out quickly and it's very dense, then you might have it spread in a shorter time. So here's just two examples. You can go to that. Where you can see the difference if you were to, try to get something out through these two systems. Say there's some, you could think about it as how gossip moves, or you could think about it as some new strategy in terms of classroom activities or instructional approaches move. It's going to be very different depending upon those kinds of underlying relationships that exist. These are just two of our network maps from schools that we did the survey with. And each of these dots, or are they squares, are individuals in the school. And again, these are bounded networks. So these are all the teachers and leaders in the school. We did it based on anybody who's sort of involved in instructional practices. So it's not necessarily everybody who works in the school, but everybody who's connected to instructional practices. The density you can see is, quite different in school one. These are sort of extreme versions where you see that there are very few ties between any of the other people. They're all sort of going in towards that center person. And we can talk a little bit more here, I guess, on how when we use the network maps, we use different strategies with size and shapes and colors to help us in our analysis steps. Alan, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say just a couple of points here. So, the thing about dense networks is that they, as Kara beautifully said, able to move like tacit, sometimes more complex information. But there's also, remember this whole affordances and constraints? Downside is that in really dense networks, that everyone tends to know what everybody else knows. And it could be that not so great things are moving through that network too, right? So again, what we're trying to do in our work is just to understand something about the structure. And it's also important to always couple these kinds of methods with other kinds of approaches like interviews, et cetera. The other thing I want to point out here, unless Kara, you want to talk about, do you want to talk about the isolates?
Sure. Alicia, did you have a question?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask something about resiliency of networks. So I was just thinking about, if I were to break some of the ties in school one, those people would be totally on their own, as opposed to in school two, if you break a few ties, it's okay because there's other things reinforcing it.
Great point. So, and you get at something else, which is which ties are broken. So in school two, if that big orange tie is, if that person leaves, which is what happened, then you can also have a huge impact. So, yes, this is exactly why longitudinal networks can be important, because they can show you, and this is what we've done in our work, how that those, either the ties don't remain at, they come and go, or the people come and go. So there's two different ways to think about that.
And maybe this is a good point to stop and say, wow, these maps are super cool, which we hope you're saying, but you may also be saying how did you get these? And so for the work that we're displaying here, although we've done other kinds of work, but the work we're displaying here, we've collected them in a bounded way, as Kara was saying earlier. So in other words, if you were a teacher in school 1, you got a list of all the folks that were connected to instructional practices, what Kara was talking about earlier. And then we ask you to think about your relationships with all those people. So everybody's doing that. And once you're done that, you take that data, clean it up, and you put it into a number of different programs. For some of ours, we'll use UCINet. And this is a really nice user-friendly program that Steve Borgatti and others have developed, and it's well used. But if you were more, if you felt more comfortable in the R environment, you could do it in R. You could also do it in another open source program called Gephi. So there are a variety of different places in which you can enter this information. But again, these are examples of bounded kinds of networks. Certainly other kinds of networks exist that don't have those nice clean boundaries around them.
So Alan had mentioned a minute ago the isolates, whether I was going to talk about them. So I just will very quickly. He's circling them right now. On the left side of each map, you see some dots. Those are people who they didn't say they went to anybody for research evidence, and nobody said they went to them. So they are off on the side. So that's really important because it shows if you have isolates, and we can see who those people are in terms of their positions or how long they've worked at the organization or different kinds of characteristics or attributes that can be helpful to understanding the network structure itself. And to your point, Alicia, we also can see, as we've done our work over time, you know, who's moving in and out of the network at different points. And that can be really critical too.
And if you were to marry the chocolate of Liz Farley Ripple and Henry May's work around survey with the peanut butter of the social networks, which is what Kara and I do, then you can layer on top of these social networks people's perceptions around the kinds of evidence they use or the levels of trust that they have in the system or organizational learning or whatever it might be. So then you get this really interesting thing of relationships by perception. And so it's also another reason why when Kara and I do our work that we're asking other kinds of questions beyond just, you know, to whom are you getting research evidence from? So.
Great. You want to go to the next one? So this is another, this is a minute ago with schools. These are now districts, just to again show you a little bit of how we use these maps to understand these things. And so, you know, one thing that we often are doing, as I mentioned at the beginning, is we're having both principals and central office leaders. We consider that a leadership network in a district. And so in this example, we have central office leaders are red and principals are blue, and you know, these are probably sized by centrality. And we have these different things that we can do visually to help us look at some of the patterns of the measures that we see. There's also, we often are asking in terms of frequency of relationships or strength of ties, I guess. And so you could have 4 different, you know, we might be asking you, I think that often we're saying something like how often, like in the last week, in the last 2 weeks, things like that. And so if you think about it, the opportunity then allows us to also manipulate which tie level we want to look at. Do we want to look at just sort of, you know, any tie, which can be less compelling sometimes than thinking about the more frequent ones. So if you sort of think about it as another way of, this is the GT2, it's like we can do ties that are only the most frequent ones, which are probably the people you're getting the most of your information from, compared to, say, if you say that you talk to them, you know, once a year. I'm just giving an example to show you how then you can manipulate those to make them binary instead, or something like that when you're working with the network data. Next. So we also talk, oh yeah, sorry.
Can I jump in with a question?
Yes.
Sure.
I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about how you use those visuals during your analysis process. So do you use generate your variables like centrality, density, et cetera, or centrality, reciprocity, and then based on your statistical analyses, determine types of networks and then kind of pull, like these are illustrative of particular structures we're seeing, or do you actually visualize all of your networks and analyze them using the visuals?
Yeah, that's a great question, Megan. So, so what's important to keep in mind, as the question is indicating, is that all of this is based on graph theory, which means a little bit later on, we can show you a bunch of metrics. So while we're showing you pictures of these particular network maps, because they sort of evoke some intuitive understanding about social relationships, you can also present all of this data by showing strings of numbers, right? So generally what we'll do is we'll calculate out all the metrics. So we have like these Excel spreadsheets that have density, reciprocity, and all that stuff. And then we'll look at those to try to figure out what's going on. And then we'll start visualizing some things. I will say, as a matter of course, we will generally do quite a bit of visualization also, because it sort of helps give us a quick intuitive sense about what's going on. So for example, these graphs are really good. We didn't know what we would find. We didn't realize that the central office would in fact be so central. And so you can sort of see it in the metrics that we can run, but then when you visualize it, you're like, wow, okay, this really tells us something really clearly. But I think what's important, Megan, and the cool thing about the social network stuff is that you can use these maps qualitatively, and you can run all this quantitative background metrics on them and produce models and do all kinds of really super cool stuff. I will say when Karen and I share this data back, which we're committed to doing, we almost exclusively use the visualizations as the lead part, but then we always include the metrics.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So reciprocity is another one that can be really useful to thinking about the overall network structure and what, sort of the quality of what's flowing. And the reason why is because reciprocity is considered, if you think about it, it's like considered a little bit of a stronger tie, because it means that I'm going to Alan and Alan's coming to me. And so, when we've asked things about, say, collaboration, that can be really important as a checkpoint on the self-reported data, because if I say I collaborate with Alan and he says he doesn't collaborate with me, then that's something that you could see, you could use as a quality indicator of whether you're getting high quality data. But more often we see that, this kind of reciprocity piece can help us to understand trust that's in those relationships. And it's just calculated as basically when you have a mutual tie versus when you have any tie. And it can support those more complex kinds of ideas and practices or novel ideas, as we were talking about earlier, that, these were low performing schools and low performing systems, and, having to get new ideas into those classrooms, for example, or principals' hands, it's really important whether they trust who they're getting it from. So that's, not just in our work, but in other work around research evidence, this trust piece is key. So this reciprocity measurement helps us with that. I think that we have a map to show you, unless do you have something? Yeah. And this is just, the way we ask the questions are directional. And so, like, as I mentioned, if I say I go to Alan or Alan says he comes to me, that's part of how we ask the question. And then the arrows that you see are which direction it's going. And so this, the big arrow is pointing to a tie that's reciprocal. And this can, again, just help you, we can do some visualization also here with how, that could be red, or, it could be bigger, or, and that kind of, again, helps you with understanding some of the patterns, I guess, to your question before, some of the patterns of the relationships that happen. It's not just the calculation of, how many there are of those, but where they are in the network, especially as you're thinking about the other question earlier about how if somebody's coming and going, how is that impacting the quality of ties that exist?
Mm-hmm. And I'll also say on this too, just as a matter of note of how about the mixing methods bit, is that when we run the maps or run the analysis, depending on how we want to look at it, we're actually identifying people to whom we should go and talk to based on their social structural position, not always where they are in the formal network. So in other words, like, this particular individual might be actually quite important. It obviously is important in this system. And that person might not show up on an organizational chart as somebody you want to go and talk to. So one of the things to think about is using also the social networks as a sampling strategy. So let's talk about a couple of other key metrics that you'll often hear about in social networks. And I just want to pause for a moment and remind you all that Karen and I are just selecting a few metrics out of the vast array of social network algorithms and metrics that you can have. There are people in their mom's basements generating tons of algorithms about this. And you can see all manner of these things. We're just going to highlight just a couple of. Density is a key one, reciprocity is a key one. Let's talk about degree centrality and betweenness, just as a couple of the really important ones. So take a look at this map. This is a map that Steve Borgatti often uses in his work. He's a really good, thoughtful scholar in this space. And so we'll use this to illustrate a couple of these other terms. So the next term is this idea around degree centrality. So in other words, Linda has high degree centrality because a lot of people are connecting with Linda and Linda's connecting with a lot of people. That means, as we said before, Linda has disproportionate influence over the system. She can reach a whole bunch of folks pretty quickly, right? We can also think about this idea around betweenness. And this is something Kara and I have been really pushing on in our work, as we mentioned before. And betweenness is a measure of how often an actor sits between otherwise disconnected actors. And this is a really important position because keep in mind that Conrad here could be moving the information from this group to this group and deciding what gets moved. The same is true for this information here and moving it this way. Everything has to go through Conrad. In some ways, Conrad also forms like a bottleneck. So if we think about some more specific, what we mean when we talk about centrality, we can think about degree centrality. And the work that Kara and I do, because it's directional, we're looking at incoming ties and outgoing ties. So in other words, if the question is, who do you turn to for research evidence, for example, and I identify Kara, that's an outgoing tie, an out degree tie from me to Kara. If Kara was in fact to identify me, that would be an incoming tie, an in degree for me. And so we can calculate out the number of incoming and outgoing ties for each actor, and we can assign numbers to that. And when you're centrally located, a lot of in degree and out degree, it's seen as an opportunity to both be influential about what's moving in the system, but also you're highly exposed to what's flowing through the network. So for example, if you're not socially distancing and you're with a big crowd of people and you're connected to this crowd of people, you're going to have a higher opportunity of being exposed as opposed to being isolated, for example.
Could you clarify one point on this for me?
Sure, of course, Christy.
So if you look at these maps, you might have Linda or Pete or someone, and they might have they might really hit high on one of the variables. And my question is, the degree to which you're assessing that variable through a particular sort of research question, right? So I'm assuming that Pete or Linda are important because of their role in the use of research evidence for education, for instance, but that it would look potentially different if you were just saying, Pete and Linda, how are you connected on other issues with your network?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we're privileging the research evidence discussion here today, but in fact, when we ask our social network questions, we're asking things about close friendship, collaboration, expertise, and the social structures look very different. And you can actually measure out how different they are or how the same they are. So it's totally true. Pete can play a very different social structural position in a friendship relationship than he does in a research evidence relationship. But the other really cool thing you can do is you can also mix relationships. For example, let's pretend you had a friendship. Chrissy, let's pretend we're BFFs, right? And we're in each other's network. I don't know if the kids say that anymore, but if that's bestie, whatever the kids are saying these days. And I also seek advice from you. So we have a multiplex relationship. I go to you for advice and we're friends. We can actually combine those relationships and really say people that are friends and go to one another for advice get a different kind of advice than I'm just going to somebody just for advice. So one, the structure difference on the kinds of resources that are moving through the network. And secondly, you can combine these things that are of particular interest depending on your research question.
Great. And maybe if I can add to that, I would imagine that there might be some interesting findings or points to analyze around the formal versus informal, right? I'm asking for advice on whether or not I should tell a colleague about this new methodology or this research study that I read about education or not. And I'm going to ask my friend, but they indirectly have this influence over whether or not I pass it and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And some of the work that Karen and I have been doing is showing that that research evidence is, let's see, how do we say this? It's not always that people are taking the best research evidence. Like, let's pretend there's a thing called the best research evidence. They're more likely to take evidence from a trusted colleague, right? So all things being equal, if I got two equally great pieces of evidence and one is flowing through a stranger, somebody I don't have a connection to, another one is flowing through somebody I have a high trust relationship with, I'm more likely to go with the one through the high trust relationship, which indicates that it's more than about the relationship perhaps than necessarily about the evidence itself. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, because oftentimes we assume that evidence moves through very linear and very typical channels. Like, we create a policy and we send it out, and of course everybody's going to take it up. But often that's mediated by the relationships that we have.
Great, thanks.
I'll just add one thing, and then I think Megan had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Megan.
No, that's okay. And to that point also, that, just in terms of how we use them in combination, we've also created an attribute of people as being like a high research user from our research evidence network. And then we put that into our expertise network as an attribute. And so you can see, like, okay, are they turning to people, that are not the research users, or they are the research users? So that's another way we've used them in combination. Megan, did you have a question?
I did, and this might be premature, so you can punt it if you'd like. But I was curious if you have ever, I guess, mapped like a two-mode network. So not just mapping the connections between people as the nodes, but I imagine in this content area in particular, when we're talking about evidence use, like mapping ideas could be an interesting way of understanding the flow of ideas through a network and how they're related to individuals. So anyway, I just wondered if you had thought about that or how that's played into your work.
Yeah, you get gold star for using excellent vocabulary. So two-mode network, a simple example is like looking at two different meetings and then looking at who attended those meetings, and then saying perhaps there's a connection between those, or looking at a research report, who's connected with that research report, and then looking at the relationships between them. So that's a really super interesting way to approach work in this space. And we've got some colleagues that have done some work, and some of their names are escaping. I think Joe Ferrari has done some work in that space, but it's a really interesting thing to think about, because you could imagine, while we're talking about people here, you could also imagine events or research reports or other kinds of things. So you're totally right, Megan. Karen and I haven't done that with our work, but that's certainly the data we had. We could do something like that. So not a puntable question at all. So betweenness. This is our new favorite thing recently. So betweenness of brokerage, just as a reminder, it's how often does an actor sit in the path between two otherwise disconnected actors, right? So B sits in the middle of A and C because A and C don't have a direct relationship. So what brokers do is they bridge structural holes. In other words, resources could never get from A to B. I say never in a social structural sense, could never get from A to B and A to C unless B was there. So it's a hole in the network. And what brokers do is they span that hole. They provide a bridge over this space that's in the network. And as I mentioned earlier, this allows the potential for gatekeeping, controlling the flow, and it can also serve as a liaison between otherwise separate parts of the network. And there's some really interesting ways to look at this. Some of the research has suggested that brokers retain a lot of power by keeping folks separated. They keep their social structural position. Others have argued actually brokers, when they bring people together, make the network even stronger. Now, if you reflect back on that exercise we had you do, we asked you to think in your minds, what would happen if you connected two otherwise disconnected people in your own network? In other words, you in that sense were going to be the broker connecting otherwise disconnected others. So brokers are really important to pay attention to. And I'm going to give you an example from some of the work that we've been doing, and this will kind of give you an idea of the scope of what we've been undertaking. So let me give you a quick overview about what you're looking at here. All the nodes here that are in black, that indicates that they work at a central office. So directors of curriculum, assistant superintendents, et cetera. if you see these colored nodes out here, like the green one and the teal and the yellow, those represent principals. Okay. And this district is big. So what they've done is they've organized sets of principals by area. So each of these colored groups of nodes here represents a principal, it represents an area in the district. Each area has an area superintendent. That's indicated by this upward facing triangle here. Okay. So you've got this yellow area, they've got a assistant or area superintendent. You've got this green one, they've got an area superintendent. And what Karen and I have done here is we've sized the nodes, made it bigger based upon the amount of brokering that they're doing inside of the district. So this is brokering research evidence. So in other words, a bigger node here means that you are moving evidence from the central office to the principals and from the principals back to the central office. Okay, so you're really actively moving evidence back and forth. And so what you can see right off the bat is that there are certain areas superintendents that do a lot of brokering around research evidence and for their whole areas, and others that are doing hardly any at all. And so even though a system may think it's moving in some coherent direction because they're moving evidence around, it might not be the case that the entire system is actually having access to that evidence. And that's why brokers are so critical. And so using the social networks to sort of think about where people are in this brokering space, are there people in the formal role, area superintendents that should be doing the brokering, that actually in reality aren't engaging in very much brokering? So you're going to see more of these in a second because Karen and I in a little bit are going to turn you loose to look at some actual data. So this is one of our network maps, and the question that you're going to be looking at uses the same question here. So which administrators regularly bring new ideas from research that you use? And by regularly, we mean twice a month. And for this particular question, by research, we mean empirical studies. And so as Karen mentioned earlier, the red ones here are central office, and the blue represents principals. We also have some other information on here around high and low, for example. And Megan, I think to your point earlier, you'll notice here we're including all the metrics that would be comprised of that. So try to move back and forth on these metrics. So we can also size these by different shapes. So for example, this one is sized by in degree, meaning that more people the nodes that are bigger are ones that are more identified as regularly bringing new ideas from research evidence. So we can see right off the bat quickly here that the district office is really disproportionately influencing and bringing in new ideas from research evidence in relative comparison to the principals themselves. So we're going to take a bit of a pause here because we're about to transition, because we're going to transition you into some hands-on activity. And we're going to provide you with some network data and have you take a look at it and try to sense make around it just to get a feel for what it means to look at things from a social network perspective. So Kara, why don't I share the handout screen, and then while I'm sharing it and you're talking about it, I'll dump the file into the chat.
Great. So Mary Ellen's going to help us put you into groups of 3. And your job is to look at some of the maps similar to what Alan was just showing you. You're going to have a few different ones, and you'll see at the beginning of the handout that he sends, there's some information that helps to remind you of, the things you're looking at in terms of the ties, the direction of the ties, and, in degree, out degree, those kinds of things. And what we want you to do is just go, look at them. Everybody brings different lenses and perspectives to this work. And so in your group, we want you to look at the measures and the networks. I guess, Alan, if you want to show them one of the pictures.
Yeah.
So you're going to look at something like this. You're going to, as a group, just see what kinds of things you notice. And then there's a few different maps that if you'll see that some of these are, they're not color coded, but they're sized, as you can see. And then a few, if you want to go to the last one, Alan, and you can show them that there's also one that has, I think it's the last one, has departments. And so you might want to look at that. You're going to think about things like direction of ties, reciprocity, isolates, whatever comes up for your group. So we want you to go do this for about 10 minutes and then come back to share with us what you noticed.
So the first thing I just want to do a check on is to make sure, did a file show up in the
Now
chat box?
Yes.
Okay.
Does
Great.
everybody see it?
So go ahead and download that. And while you're downloading it, just to point out a couple of things, Karen and I in that handout have provided a little cheat sheet on how to read the maps because there's a lot going on. And then what we'd like you to do, as Kara was saying, is just sort of like check them out and see if you can see some patterns and what jumps out at you. So let me stop sharing here and make sure everybody was everybody able to download the file? Awesome. Mary Ellen, maybe we'll turn it over to you to send people into groups without sending Kara and I.
Uh-oh, we lost some people.
They're having too
I think
much
they're
fun
still
talking
coming
in their group.
back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Christy, where are you from? I'm guessing Canada.
Yeah. Thanks. I am from Canada, indeed. But
Are you in
sometimes people
Canada?
say that my accent isn't right on.
Where in Canada are you?
Victoria on the West Coast. Actually on
right.
Vancouver Island.
Oh, that's
nice.
Sleepy little wonderful
there.
place. Yeah.
Would you please let in
it's
some
great.
Americans if we ask nicely?
Not at the moment, no, but possibly in the
Yeah.
future.
Needs to be now. Okay, I think we're all back. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome back.
Here, well, welcome back. We just have a few minutes left before we send you all on your ways to think about the social relationships between beer or wine or anything else for that matter. So we just wanted to see if, what came up for you in your discussions, what you noticed, what questions you had, insights, musings, anything you'd like to share. And just let us know you'd like to do that by waving your hands wildly. Or by doing an interpretive dance, we'll take that too. Only one interpretive dance at a time, please. Thanks.
Yay.
Thanks, Samantha. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. Is really interesting to me. I think what's cool is that you can kind of tell a story about what's going on with the different pieces of it. I guess that's all. It's just that we kind of came up with a story of what was happening in those last 3 or 4 maps, where one group is, I think it was student services and curriculum services are getting information from somewhere, and business is giving services, and then the student services is this kind of helping to relay that as a between party. And it's just, yeah. And I personally am thinking about this from a kind of TA and helping systems to use this info.
Oh, I just lost you. I don't know if other people can hear. Just right at the end, I lost you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I said, yeah, so it's fun to think about how this could be a really interesting tool for supporting systems to implement and adopt evidence-based and research-based practices.
Great, thank you. I'll say definitely that it's been our experience over the number of years now that these kinds of maps really catalyze interesting conversations, because when you start seeing these disconnected patterns or overly connected patterns, then folks that are inside those systems start talking to each other about it. And it catalyzes some interesting reflection on the role of relationships and their current social networks. So thank you for that, Samantha. We have time for one more wildly waving hand and or interpretive dance, if we have one. Yeah, thanks, Alicia.
We were just also talking about how the context of what it is you're studying is important, it looks like, to developing the map. So, here you were looking at use of evidence-based research, but I've been thinking, I work a lot with youth, and I've been thinking about doing more around youth networks and how you can perhaps use social networks. Like, for example, in the summer jobs program in Boston this summer, we had one track that was developing a COVID-19 marketing campaign aimed towards youth. Like, how do you get youth to wear a mask? I don't know. I'm an adult. No one's going to listen to me. So, but I was thinking about, one way to make that the most effective would be figuring out, the relationships between people and the kinds of information. Like, but not everybody might be giving out that kind of information about what to do or what's smart, right? Like, so you might go to different people for different kinds of information, which you kind of got at earlier, but it just made me think that it's really important to study the network in the context of the thing you want to know about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really important. We've got some other work going underway around breastfeeding and social networks, and we see some of the same important role of the context. So thank you for that. So Kara, do you want to say some closing remarks, and I'll say some closing remarks, and we'll let these good people go about their rest of their day?
Sure. Well, thanks for joining us. It was nice to have you in this workshop. And we hope that it just gives you a sense of some of the ways that you can use networks in your own work, or as you were just talking about, whether it's research or technical systems or different things. Obviously, there are strategies that, are from the ego networks perspective or the structure of the network, and it depends on your research questions and those kinds of things. But to give you a little taste of it, at least, and the ways you might use it in your work, we're glad you joined us today. Thanks.
Yeah, and just to echo that, we're super happy you're here, and thanks a lot for taking your time. We know it's a really crazy time, and it's a long week. You've all been zoomed out, I'm sure. And so we'll just end by saying peace, love, and understanding, which is what I think the world needs most of nowadays, more than anything. So take care of yourselves and be safe, and we'll see you all again soon, I hope.